Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Thomas D.
And me, Rob Cockerill.
And Rob, today we're going to be talking about the trade-offs between growth and net zero. But let me give you a reminder of why exactly it is that we're talking about this.
There is no trade-off between economic growth and net zero. Quite the opposite. Net zero is the industrial opportunity of the 21st century, and Britain must lead the way.
Well, that was UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves there. I guess the launch, or her in fact saying that they're going to add a third runway to Heathrow Airport. And that does bring into the question, is there a trade-off in fact between growth and net zero?
I think there's always a trade-off, isn't there? There's always a trade-off, but I think we need to be more proactive in actually doing, and we do need to get behind net zero, don't we? We need to get further behind it and make it happen, make the investment happen, and make the business case around that.
Yeah, we certainly do. And in fact, just last week, I sat down with Dimitri Zenghelis, who's an economist based at the University of Cambridge, the London School of Economics and Independent Economics. He advises governments, financial institutions, central banks, NGOs, as well as international organisations on various economic matters, so macroeconomics, sustainability, climate change, wealth, distribution, innovation, economic modelling, and clean urbanisation. So it's great to sit down with him to get his take on this.
I've not heard this yet, so this should be good.
Yes, well, on that, let's listen to it now, shall we? And I'm delighted to say that I've now been joined by Dimitri Zenghelis on the 1895. Dimitri, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thank you, Tom.
So let's dive straight into this conversation. So shall we? Just last week here in the UK, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, said that there is no trade-off between economic growth and net zero. So first off, what would be your thoughts on that statement? And is it in fact true?
So as a broad statement, it is true. For the most part, the effort to decarbonise and meet our net zero requirements will actually boost efficiency, boost innovation, and generate growth. It does that through boosting productivity. A lot of the technologies that we're seeing as part of the decarbonisation process are responding to increased learning by doing and economies of scale in the production of new kit, not just the production, but the distribution, the installation and the maintenance of that kit. The costs have come down far, far faster than we expected, such that many of these new technologies in renewables, in storage, and electric vehicles are now outcompeting conventional sources of energy generation. And that's a growth story, and it's also a growth story from a regional perspective. Those countries and regions that make the upfront investment to build the supply lines, to build the knowledge clusters, to invest in the skills of these new technologies are the ones that tend to capture competitive new markets. We've seen the Chinese do that very successfully through strategic decisions to support solar PV, electric vehicles and batteries. They've now cornered the market in a way that's very difficult for the rest of the world, in particular in Europe and the US, to catch up. So in that respect, the clean technologies are not only a strong growth story, they're arguably the only viable long-term growth story. That doesn't mean that there won't be upfront costs in investment, and that doesn't mean that there won't be some sectors, carbon capture and storage, for example, or aviation might be another example, where there are some trade-offs between growth and decarbonisation. But for the most part, I think that statement is very accurate.
Sure, and in that same conference, I suppose that Rachel Reeves said that she did, in fact, reference sustainable aviation fuel and carbon capture, which of course we're interested here at GWGI and the 1895 podcast. So I guess how is the energy transition going to impact upon economic growth in the short term and then once again in the longer term?
Well, it's very clear who the winners of this are going to be. It's going to be those countries, but also those companies and investors who strategically invest in assets that are future-proofed. These are resilient assets which will not be potentially stranded by locking into high carbon infrastructure, high carbon skills. So it's your physical capital, it's human capital, and it's intangible capital, the ideas, the technologies, the processes. Because those sectors, as we are seeing, are likely to be outcompeted by new technologies, but also face quite hostile and restrictive policies in terms of their emissions. So, even for potentially high carbon, hard to abate sectors like steel, cement, haulage, a lot of these companies are thinking that it makes sense to become best in class in terms of efficiency and in terms of emissions reduction. So the change is going to affect all of us. And it's very clear that from a risk and opportunity perspective, those that move early are likely to be better placed to cope with the winds of change in the global economy that we're seeing. And, before you bring in Donald Trump, let me give you Trump as an example. 10 years ago, if the US had said we're pulling out of the Paris Agreement and we're going to, unwind our commitments to the renewable transition, the Indians, the Chinese, and the other developing countries that are playing a role in this would have said, well, if you're not prepared to take your share of responsibility for this, then we aren't either, because we want to develop our growth strategies. Those were in the days when decarbonisation was seen as a cost. Wind forward to the present time, you can see a palpable difference in the reaction from China, from India and elsewhere, where this is just seen as a great opportunity for them to steal a march on America. If America's going to shoot itself in the foot in these fast-growing markets, then the Chinese, the Indians, and indeed the Europeans to some extent are very happy to step in and take their place. We're going to see American car companies move to Chapter 11 bankruptcy proceedings in the near term, and we're going to see America fall behind in the race to develop these new technologies. So it is a competitive race, but the political decisions and the corporate decisions have to be strategic and have to be framed in terms of risk management and opportunity.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned Donald Trump there and sort of the winds of change, because we do see various countries now worldwide seemingly ditching or at least pushing their net zero targets and goals to the side in the name of growth. So does that mean that there, in fact, does need to be a trade-off between net zero and growth, or will time tell in how the US economy reacts in the next 5 years, I guess?
I mean, but are we really? Are we really seeing countries roll back on their ambition? We're certainly seeing Donald Trump in America doing that. But if you look at the last decade, if you look at this country, if you look at Europe, if you look at China, if you look at India, the movement has been very clearly towards tightening ambition on emissions reductions. It may not be a linear process, and changing leaders and changing governments may, alter the pace by which those countries move towards decarbonisation. But I would say that actually that secular trend has been very clear in one direction. And the reason for that is, what I alluded to earlier. Increasingly, this is seen as a strategic commercial decision. If you want to be among the leaders in the new economy, and if you want to take advantage of the fastest growing opportunities, then you will want to move quickly in this direction. Saudi Arabia plans to generate half of its electricity from renewables by 2030. This is Saudi Arabia, where the marginal extraction cost of oil and gas is incredibly low and well below the current price. So, it's clear that all countries see some benefits, and all countries see advantage in having a stake in the economy of tomorrow, even if there are short-run opportunities from maintaining the economy of today. So there is this tension. And of course, fossil fuels are OPEX-based, so the costs are really in extraction, distribution, transportation, refining, and so on, whereas many of these renewable technologies and electrification are very CapEx-based. So not a lot of upfront investment, But once you've got your turbines and your solar arrays going, they don't require much operating cost, a little bit of maintenance, someone with a squeegee and so on. But for the most part, they generate energy at zero marginal cost. So that's a change in the financing structure and the revenue and profit model. But it doesn't undermine the fact that these technologies are increasingly efficient and therefore profitable in the medium to long term.
Sure, and the renewables coming out of Saudi Arabia, partially down to the NEOM project, which they're involved in, which is a lot of green hydrogen coming from there, from air products, etc.
That's right. I mean, it's a realization that they don't want to be dinosaurs. They want to make money. They want to pump hard while there's a market. They don't want to talk down the prospects of fossil fuels, because oil and gas are storable and fungible. So if you talk down the future opportunities, that will have an impact on the price today. And the last thing they want is a lower price, because while there's still opportunity to use this stuff, they want to do so, with the highest margins. But they recognize that they need to transition some of their asset base into these new technologies so that they have a viable medium to long-term energy strategy, as well as one that's profitable in the short run.
Sure. To move on to opportunity now, you've referenced opportunity a few times in this conversation so far, and I believe I read that the energy transition market is set to be worth over $2 trillion by 2035. So a huge wedge of money, obviously. So where is the opportunity in both growth and net zero going forward with energy and emissions goals in mind?
Well, the opportunity is in delivering energy more cheaply and more efficiently. These technologies, they don't start cheap, and this is the point I made before about learning by doing and economies of scale. They start expensive. They require taxpayers' money to get them over the hump. But once you achieve this dynamic and these kind of tipping points and momentums where greater deployment means lower costs, but lower costs induces greater deployment, you get this reinforcing feedback and you get change that happens much more rapidly than anticipated. And indeed, no one 10 years ago was expecting 80 to 90% reductions in the cost of solar PV energy and the cost of lithium-ion batteries, slightly smaller reductions, but still pretty spectacular reductions in the cost of wind generation. The reason they didn't expect it, and the reason that most of us were caught by surprise, and the same argument applies to electric vehicles, is because of these reinforcing feedbacks. You stick a microphone in front of a speaker, you get very rapid change and you get very unstable change. They're difficult to forecast the outcomes. But those are the kinds of processes that we need to expect across the gamut of technologies, including hard-to-abate sectors, including things like steel, cement, industry, aviation, agriculture, and food. Once innovation starts to move in that direction, and once investors see risk-adjusted profits in these sectors, they will begin to invest, and the investment itself becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy by bringing the costs down. So that's where the opportunity lies, and the flip side of that is the risk, that if you don't move in that direction, if you're stuck with legacy technologies and legacy industries, if you lock in to inefficient high carbon infrastructure, you may be left with stranded or devalued assets in the future. And the wonderful thing about the markets is that they will discount that prospect into asset values today. We've had Trump, we've had Ukraine, we've had COVID. These things don't move in a straight line, but it's pretty clear what the direction of travel is in this sector.
Sure. So we've got the opportunity, we've got the growth. So I guess the big question is, how much do we need to invest, and can we afford it? This is something that you covered in a recent report that you were in fact the lead author on, titled "Is Reaching Net Zero a Growth and Prosperity Plan?" So how much do we in fact need to invest?
A lot, several trillions worldwide each year. That's not a trivial amount. If you look at it in terms of proportions of GDP, it's not as large. It's a couple of percentage points of GDP, but that is a significant amount of money. The great news is that the private sector is doing this anyway. We're already seeing the private sector invest more, or the private sector has been investing more in private and government, but mostly private, have been investing more in renewables over the last decade than they have in conventional fossil fuels for electricity generation. And in recent years, they've just invested more in all fuels, including transport, than they have in fossil fuel generation. The role of the government is not to pay for this stuff. That's going to come from the private sector. The role of government is to provide an enabling environment where investors can commit their money in the confidence that there will be risk-adjusted returns in these sectors. And let's not forget, we're talking about transport, we're talking about energy, we're talking about buildings. These are very heavily policy-driven, regulation-led sectors. They're the most heavily regulated, policy-driven sectors in our economy for good reason. So policy is critical in inducing innovation. Some of that will require upfront investment in core infrastructure. Most of that is sending the right signals, providing the right policy frameworks, providing the right incentives, standards, regulations, pricing, support for R&D and deployment, all the rest of it. But the real financing is going to come from the private sector, but it will come voluntarily. If you look at the shift from the horse and cart to the car, that required a lot of investment in technologies, in production lines, in refineries, in oil extraction, in highways, and so on. Trillions of dollars in today's money. Nobody would argue that we should have stuck with the horse and cart and that investment wasn't worthwhile. And so it is with the clean transition. And that's what the Chinese have realized. They put a little bit of money strategically to support sectors which are now cleaning up in terms of cornering markets and making great profits for Chinese industry.
You've mentioned it there, but I think it's important we stay on this topic. And I guess it underpins this whole discussion today, and indeed the statement from Rachel Reeves that started this conversation. But it is that who actually pays for the energy transition? You said it's going to come from private money. So how do governments and policymakers balance the needs of net zero, but also without making, me and you pay the price?
So Ed Miliband's right. Our energy bills are going to be lower as a result of the transition. Indeed, if we restructured our energy markets to some extent, they would be lower already. We don't need to get into the reeds here on the structure of the UK energy market and how prices to consumers are calculated. But within a relatively short space of time, our energy will be cheaper than it would have been, and indeed would already be cheaper had we pushed to move to renewables faster than we have done. That's often not recognised, and you'll often hear a narrative that tells you it's the other way around and that it's green technologies that are putting costs up. Now, to some extent in the early period, somebody does need to pay for the investment. Somebody does need to pay for the wind farms. Somebody does need to pay for the grid and the transformers and all the rest of it. Somebody also needs to pay for the technology that allows us to use energy more efficiently, for example, through demand responsiveness or through interlinking our grids so that we can get the cheapest energy from the cheapest source at any one time. So these investments are necessary, and it's not just financial investment. It's a degree of kind of personal and psychological investment. There's a lot of disruption. People will have to kind of accept efficiency gains in their houses, which means that that you'll have to get your roof lagged and you might have to get your boiler changed. So for all of this, I think you do need government support. You also need government support to retool and reskill workers, engineers who can install heat pumps rather than gas boilers, for example. That requires government outlay, and it requires support for those who will lose from this transition, people who are directly employed in the fossil fuel industry, people who can't afford electric vehicles, who live in parts of the country that aren't connected to good public transport, often people who are at the lower end of the income distribution. So these people need to be supported, they need to be encouraged, and they need to be given the tools and the skills to take advantage of the opportunities from the transition. And until we get that commitment, you will tend to get a lot of popular resistance to this kind of change. And that resistance is real, and it needs to be recognized.
Sure. So that's obviously a challenge in itself for the governments in the UK and of the world indeed. But what other challenge are policymakers up against in an economic sense?
Well, I mean, I think you alluded to the cost side. I've said already that most of the costs will be borne by the private sector, and it will be borne by the private sector because it's seen as a commercial opportunity. But that doesn't mean that the government can rely solely on policy measures. Policy measures are critically important, and they don't have to cost anything. Carbon pricing can generate revenues, for example. Standards and regulations don't cost the government anything, but R&D support and deployment support does, and investment in core infrastructure and skills does. And so that's going to be a part of the story. And so at a time when there's relatively little fiscal room, there needs to be a recognition that these investments, which only the public sector can make, generate ready returns. So I think some of the moves that Rachel Reeves has made in changing the fiscal rules to allow for investment, recognizing that investment actually generates assets, so we're looking at net worth rather than just one side of the balance sheet, debt, allows governments the room for maneuver to justify to the bond markets that this increase in short-term debt to invest in these sectors are entirely fiscally sustainable, not only fiscally sustainable, but the only fiscally sustainable route, because they generate the growth, they generate the tax revenues that allow you to bring down debt in the future. Don't forget, debt to GDP has GDP in the denominator. So if the fastest growth opportunities reside in these new markets, then neglecting to invest in them at either a public or a corporate level is going to undermine your ability to repay debt. That's true of governments, that's true of the private sector as well. No successful commercial organization thinks that the optimal amount of debt is zero. If it did, it would never invest in its business models. And it's the same with government. It's not the level of debt that matters, that's arbitrary. It's what that debt is used for. So clarification on what that debt is used for in a credible and clear way can signal to the bond markets that there's more fiscal space available to invest in the new technologies than a government that says mixed and muddled signals and incoherent and inconsistent policies.
Maybe skewing slightly away from the conversation here, but do you think GDP is maybe an outdated method of measuring growth when it comes to things like this?
Look, GDP has strengths and weaknesses, and I appreciate the fact that GDP's weaknesses are increasingly being recognized. It's not a measure of happiness. There's a lot besides GDP that matters, and it's definitely not a measure of wealth. So, in principle, you can create a lot of GDP by kind of fleecing nature, chopping down the forests and using all your resources. But, in a few years' time, you'll live to regret that because you've undermined your wealth. So you can trade off wealth against GDP. So I think you need to look at other measures. You need to look at net worth. You need to look at wealth measures, which are stock measures. GDP is a flow measure. But once you've recognized the limitations of GDP, then I think it does a pretty good job. We've spent many, many years developing it, creating the methodologies, developing the statistical infrastructure, the surveys, and so on, to measure it quite accurately and measure it on a comparable basis. So we can look at evolution of GDP through time, and we can compare GDP across countries. So in that respect, it's a pretty good statistic. And it correlates with a lot of the things that we care about, whether it's scientific prowess, happiness and well-being, equal opportunities, you name it. They tend to correlate quite well with GDP. So given that we measure it well, I think it's a reasonable measure, but we really need to be very clear on what it's not. It's not happiness. It's not the be-all and end-all of the good life and well-being. And it certainly isn't a measure of sustainability and wealth. And we need to look at all those other things, health, livelihoods, and wealth, if we're to have an appropriate benchmark for guiding policymakers in making the right decisions.
Sure, thank you, Dimitri. And look, we've got a few minutes left here, so my final question to you is all going to be around the next steps and what needs to happen. How do we enable growth and the clean energy transition side by side? And I guess where do the investments need to be made?
Yeah, so the enabling story is a critical one. It requires coherent policy. It's important to recognize there's no silver bullet here. There's no one policy or one technology that's going to do this. It's the interaction of all the policies and technologies. It's the combinational effect of having renewables and storage and networks and AI all working together to improve the efficiency of the system through a process of innovation and productivity enhancement. And in that sense, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And that means that you need an array of policies that help support this. Some of it could be pricing, some of it will be standards and regulations, some of it might be procurement, and some of it will be support for research and deployment. But they all reinforce each other. No one policy will be as powerful without the support of the other policies. And the important thing here is that those policies send a clear and credible long-term signal to investors so that they feel safe enough to make the investments in these new technologies without raising the risk premium and without raising the cost of capital. What you don't want is unstable, unpredictable flipping and flopping of policies. I mean, the situation in America is disastrous for the American renewable industry because there just is no policy stability. Some of the states and some of the cities may plow on regardless of what Trump is doing. But the US is clearly not a safe location for investment in these new technologies. Again, I expect the Chinese, the Indians, and others are rubbing their hands in glee at this because they recognize that this is still the way the world is going to go in the future, and so that they can continue to take advantage of the opportunities and corner all the new markets. We need to catch up, and I think in Europe and in the UK, the role for policy and the role for leadership in driving private investment is still clear and unambiguous.
Thank you for that. Thank you for your time, Dimitri. I'll let you get back on with your day. So thank you for joining us on the 1895 podcast.
Tom, thanks for your time.
And that was Dimitri Zenghelis there of the London School of Economics. What did you make of that, Rob?
Well, first of all, can I just say what a great interview, Tom? You sounded fantastic there, let alone Dimitri. I think Dimitri makes some fantastic points. It's funny, isn't it? I feel like trade, we're talking about trade-off here, but trade in that very term is all we seem to hear about at the moment, particularly with the sweeping Trump administration of the last few weeks. Yeah, I think Dimitri makes some great points. We have to be mindful around stranded assets, for example. There's been a lot of talk about that in the last 5 years in particular with this energy transition. We do have to be mindful of that. But I completely agree with so much of what Dimitri's saying. And I think, we do have to consider that geopolitical impact he talked about. China, India, and others, they're taking a long-term lead and creating a short-term investment climate, aren't they? We see this in so many different sectors, and in the energy sector and the gases industry, the industrial gases industry, I should say. Middle East too, in that equation we have to consider. And I think Dimitri talks about Saudi Arabia there. They're learning by doing, as he said, but they will end up leading by doing. And I think that's a big question for the rest of the world to ponder, and actually quite quickly.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favourite quotes from it was that, he said that China and India will be rubbing their hands at the fact that, Trump is seemingly forgetting about these net zero targets and focusing on solely growth. But as we've just heard, growth and net zero can go hand in hand.
They can, and they should. They have to, don't they? It's imperative that they do. And I'm not just talking from the, some might say, the moral high ground of climate change and sustainability. They have to, anyway, we have to make the business cases for them to go hand in hand right now. We just have to make a change. We have to embrace it. Otherwise, we'll be left with a huge mountain to climb further down the line. And just personally speaking, my own, individual take on this is the Trump administration and others, let's not single this out, are looking very much at quick wins in the near term of let's say a 4-year cycle. There's no legacy view to that. This is all just a quick buck in the short term. And, we all want that. Individuals want that in their own pocket. And we don't particularly want to pay for climate change or sustainability. But it is so short term. We have to look at what's beyond that 4-year cycle, who the the next president is, or the next administration in another country. You know, we need to look beyond that. So it is so short term, it's unbelievable. And I do think we need to change that.
Yeah, certainly. And, you know, from doing that interview, it was certainly a really interesting conversation. And perhaps it'd be interesting to get some different regional viewpoints throughout the year as well on their takes from it.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other thing I would say, Tom, that stuck out to me from hearing that just now is I do agree with that question from Dimitri. Is the US really rolling back? Is it? I mean, you know, despite everything I've just said, you do have to question if we're hearing a lot of bluster right now and a lot of short-term pledges to the electorate, and actually we'll find that so much of that doesn't, you know, cascade down through the channels and actually come into action. Maybe it is a lot of rhetoric at the moment, and we remain on a steady path to sustainability. But the other point still remains: we're not moving anywhere near quick enough, and we're not addressing the business cases we need to make this happen.
Yeah, really important conversations, and ones that we'll be having throughout this year as well, won't we, with gasworld?
We will indeed. You might look back to that MENA conference, Tom, in Abu Dhabi, which was, late November, but it feels like a year away already. We talked about the MENA region taking a lead on the industrial gas stage, on supply chains. We talked about the wider energy sector taking a lead from the gases industry in terms of hydrogen and other cleaner energy vectors. And we'll be talking about it this year. You know, the APAC conference we have coming up in Bangkok, in Thailand, for example, in December. You know, we've got 2 unscripted panel discussions there about the rise of the China and India markets, and also about the APAC region's role as a whole on global industrial gas supply chains. So we see this on a kind of a micro level as well as at that global level with decarbonisation and energy policy.
And of course, carbon capture, as Dimitri discussed, that will be on the agenda in Rotterdam in a few weeks' time, and Denver later this year too.
Yeah, absolutely, for both those CO2 summits. I mean, that's a central tenet of those discussions, isn't it, in CO2? And we say it so often, but no one knows those molecules like the industrial gases industry.
Certainly not. So if that does interest any of our listeners, then do check those out on gasworldconferences.com. That's enough for today, isn't it, I think, Rob? But we'll be back next week with another exciting interview that we recorded, just a couple of days ago.
We will. Perhaps you could remind me which one that will be, Tom.
That will be with Philippe Cornille of Eiger. And that was a really interesting conversation with him. And to get Eiger's take on, the whole industry, we sat down with him for a long time.
Absolutely. And another strong interview, great interview, and very much closer to home, shall we say, in terms of, industrial gas standards, safety, best practice, harmonization. It was very free-flowing, that interview, wasn't it?
It really was. So do be sure to like, follow, and share the 1895 podcast to get that straight into your feed.